Happy Friday, everyone. Everybody excited to be here, learn about the wonderful overall auditing. I don't know if anybody will actually ever dares to shake their heads no. So it's like Dr. Barnes will see my head movement. I've got to be very careful to leave it to sedentary state. So just as a quick reminder, I talked about this earlier in the week, and I want to remind you again. I would like to try to get the groups formed for the end of semester projects. I have heard from one group that was Jack and his group had formed, and so we've got one group of six, which means there's two groups of five and one group of six left. Uh, if you have a preference of being in a group with people and got that coordinated, please reach out to me by end of day today. All right. Please let me know. If you do not have any coordination of group members, if you don't care, that's fine. I will assign you to a group. But if you have any preferences whatsoever, it doesn't need to be a full group. If you're just like, I want to be in a group with Dr. Barnes, I'd say probably no, I'm not going to be in a group with you. But you can say if it's only one or two people. All right. So it does not need to be a full group. Just let me know your preferences, and please make sure you reach out to the people you're going to be in a group with. All right. To that, real quick. So we are doing our wrap up of chapter 7, 8, and 9 today. Basically, we've got 3 more chapters that we're going to be covering. We're going to be doing one chapter each day. We're going to be doing chapter 17 on Monday, which is audit conclusion. When we get back from spring break, we're going to be doing chapter 18, which is audit reporting. Then we're going to do chapter 21 after that. And that will be the end of all of our content for before the second exam. We'll have our homework review session on Fridays. You may be wondering if we're doing stuff on Monday, what are we doing on Wednesday? Well, Friday, we won't be here. I've canceled class for Friday, so next Friday. So as much as I know you enjoy me take part of your Fridays and judging when you get to go home, and like I said, take that responsibility very seriously. I've decided that I'm not going to be responsible for that next Friday since it's right before spring break. So I can't talk to your other professors, but I can say we are not having class on Friday. On Wednesday, I think we're going to be in 1432 because I have an activity that I want to do from a research perspective. Your ask, is it audit related? And I'm going to say kind of. It is ancillary related. It's definitely accounting related, but it's a research project I'm working on that I would like your help with. We'll be doing that in the computer lab. You can bring your computer if you like to work on your computer more. You can work on the computer, it's in there. The only reason I'm just doing that is I would prefer to have computers that have full access to Excel, and there's been some issues with the computers in there as of late. But I think that's a better environment than trying to do it all in here. But yeah, that'll be Wednesday, and we'll be doing that. I will give you some instructions on that Monday about what you need to do in preparation and for advance of that. This will be an assignment for a grade. So if you can't be here on Wednesday for whatever reason, or I guess if you can't be here, you can do it online. It is possible to do it virtually. If you can't be here virtually or not, that's fine. I just won't give you. There won't be any points assigned for that grade. It's not you won't receive a 0. I just won't include that grade in your grade book. But we'll be doing an activity that will give you some extra points. So something to look forward to in that regard. And it's pretty easy. Just there's going to be some pre-work and there's going to be some work during the class period. All right. With that, we are doing chapters 7, 8, and 9 today. We have a slew of multiple choice questions to get through. So let's go ahead and get started on those. Okay, starting out, Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 requires management to include a report on the effectiveness of ICOFR in the entity's annual report. It also requires auditors to report on the effectiveness of ICOFR for large public companies. Which of the following statements concerning these requirements is false? So we're starting out right out of the gates talking about Sarbanes-Oxley Act requirements, and you have to identify which of these statements are false. So let's go ahead and go through each of these A, B, C, and D, and you tell me which ones you think are true or false. And I'll give you a big hint. One of them is false, the rest are true. Okay. Yeah, I know. That's the quality that you guys pay for, is for me to give you that kind of information. So the auditor should evaluate whether internal controls or financial reporting are designed and operating effectively. True or false? That is a true statement. Yes. Management report should state its responsibility for establishing and maintaining an adequate internal control system. What do you guys think? That's also true. Very true. Management should identify material weaknesses in its report. We're true so far. So by process of elimination, the auditor should provide recommendations for improving internal control in the audit report. Okay. What are the words there that make that statement fail? It's in the audit report. Okay. We do provide recommendations. We do not provide them in the audit report. So that's why that statement is false. All right. 720, control deviation caused by an employee performing a control procedure he or she is not authorized to perform is always considered a what? Oh, wow. Okay, so let's go ahead and evaluate C and D. Can we actually make a determination of C or D based on just the information given in this situation. We don't know what the significance of the particular scenarios, or the magnitude, I guess I should say, the magnitude of the scenario. So we can't make a judgment. And since it says always considered A, C and D are right out. So it's going to be A or B. So we have a control procedure, but they're not authorized to do it. Is that a deficiency in the design of the control or a deficiency in operation of control? What do you think? Sounds like operation to me. It sounds like operation to me. It sounds like operation to every one of you. Hopefully you answered B. B is going to be our answer. All right. Moving on, question 723. Which of the following controls would most likely be tested during an interim period? This is a good question because it's something that we alluded to, but haven't really gone into detail. But it's kind of intuitively sensible. What do we say about controls tested at interim? Our assumption is if they're being tested at interim, that they're going to continue operating the same way through the rest of the year. So we want controls that we assume have some semblance of continuity. All right, keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and go over these answers. Controls over non-routine transactions. So non-routine, does that sound like continuity to you all? No, okay. So continuity is certainly a problem with that, so we can throw out A in that. Controls over the period in financial reporting process. Now, there's probably continuity, but here's a problem. If we're concerned ourselves with controls over the year-end process, should we test those at interim? Should we test something that's really relevant to year-end at interim? Probably not. Okay, that wouldn't make much sense. All right. Controls that operate on a continuous basis. What do you think about that answer? Does that sound like continuity? Well, it's got continuous in it, so it sure sounds like continuity. So C is our answer, but let's go over D. Controls over transactions that involve a high degree of subjectivity. So if there's subjectivity, what does that probably mean? It means that every single one is going to be different. Every single scenario is going to be different, so it requires a lot of judgment. So we need to evaluate those on a case-by-case basis, and so that probably means looking at them in context at year end. All right, moving to 728. In auditing a public company, Natalie, an auditor for an NM Neal Associates, identifies 4 deficiencies, and I coffer. 3 deficiencies are unlikely to result in misstatements that are material. Okay, so likelihood is not met, so that we can eliminate that. One of the deficiencies is reasonably likely to result in misstatements that are material, not material, but significant. What type of report should Natalie issue? So let's go ahead and work through this because there's a lot of information here. It's pretty easy to disseminate once you've got the details down, but let's go ahead and work through. So the first 3 misstatements, what would we categorize those misstatements as? Would they be control deficiencies? So it says they're unlikely to result in financial statements that are material. Remember, likelihood is our first consideration. If it's not likely, does it even qualify as a control deficiency? No. Okay, not likely to result in a financial statements material. So it's probably so it says deficiencies, but we said that the likelihood criteria is not met, so we don't even need to categorize those as control deficiencies. So the last one we need to consider is that one deficiency at the end. It's reasonably likely to result in misstatements that are not material, but significant. Okay, so is this a control deficiency, a significant deficiency, or a material weakness? What do you think? This is the crux of this particular question. You've got to know whether this is a control deficiency, a significant deficiency, or material weakness. So let's go through what it says. It says misstatements that are not material. Does that mean that it's probably not a material weakness? Probably so, okay. But significant. Does that mean that it's likely a significant deficiency? Yeah, okay. So significant deficiency here. So we've identified that there's one transaction that represents a significant deficiency. What type of report do we issue if there's a significant deficiency? That was kind of the end of what we talked about in chapter 7. Unqualified report, an unqualified report. Remember, significant deficiency is not a problem now. It is likely going to be a material problem in the future, but at for a point in time, it's not a problem. Remember, my big blue van that I talked about, driving without oil. This is fine, okay? While in the engine, the fire is going on, okay? I'm like the dog in the comic. This is fine, just driving my big blue van. Yeah, so not a problem now, but certainly can be a problem in the future. But currently, we're just going to say an unqualified report. All right, question 730. Which of the following statements regarding or concerning control deficiencies is true? Well, no better way than walking through each of these. The auditor should communicate to management in writing all control deficiencies identified during the audit. What do you guys think about that one? That sounds like a pretty good one to me. I like A, but let's go through the rest. All significant deficiencies are material weaknesses. Is that a true statement? No, they're different things, okay? You might say all material weaknesses are significant deficiencies, or all significant material weaknesses, but they're kind of separate. They're different on magnitude. All control deficiencies are significant deficiencies, same argument there. An auditor must immediately report material weaknesses and significant deficiencies discovered during audits to the PCAOB. We do have to report those, but who do we report significant deficiencies to? Is it to everyone? Is it externally? No. Okay, so first of all, material weaknesses do get reported, but not specifically to the PCOB. They get reported in the audit report. Okay, so it's an external reporting. Do we include significant deficiencies in our audit report? No, but we do actually report those to another party other than management. Does anybody remember which party that is? Those charged with governance? What is that, an audit? It's a committee that's related to the audit. It's an audit committee. Yeah, okay, there we go. We got there. We got there eventually. All right. It's got to report significant deficiencies to the audit committee. All right. So D is not our answer. So A seems like a good one. All right, moving on to question 8. Or chapter 8, sorry, question 8. Samples, test, internal controls are intended to provide a basis for an auditor to conclude whether what. So this one's really not so much a question about sampling, it's just what is the purpose of testing internal controls, okay? What is probably the best identification of the purpose of testing internal controls? It says A, the controls are operating effectively. If I ask you that question, would that be a reasonable answer to that question? Yeah, and that's our answer, okay? You can ignore the same thing as the sampling, because it says sampling, that's just a way that we test internal controls or a methodology we use. But the purpose of testing controls is to make sure the controls are operating effectively. All right, question 8.14. Which of the following combinations results in the greatest decrease in sample size in an attribute sample for a test of controls? This one's an interesting question because we're assuming everything else is held constant, all right? So desired confidence level. What is the relationship between confidence level and sample size? Is it direct or inverse? So, yeah, what's that? So you're thinking sampling risk. Yeah, sampling risk is inverse. Confidence level, and it makes sense because if we want to be more confident, then we need to test more items. Okay. So confidence level is a direct relationship. Okay, direct relationship. So if I say I'm going to have a decrease in sample size, which would result in a decrease in sample size, something that decreases desired confidence level. Okay, because a direct relationship. So it's we can toss out B. Okay. Tolerable deviation rate. Okay. Now tolerable deviation rate is interesting because remember our representation is the distance between these two items. But assuming that I hold this one constant, what would decrease our sample size if I increase tolerable deviation rate or if I decrease tolerable deviation rate? So there's an inverse relationship between the distance here. Okay, the difference between these two items is it gets bigger, sample size gets smaller. Okay, so let's say I hold this one constant, I don't change that, and I just make this one larger. What's going to happen to sample size? Sample size is going to get smaller. Everybody's so afraid. It's like if I get it wrong, everything's dead. Everything's over. It's like it's a 50-50 shot, actually, guys. If you don't get it right the first time, you get it right the second time. It's kind of an interesting. So tolerable deviation rate, if it increases, sample size will decrease. So we're looking for an increase. So we're looking at in this situation, it's going to be C or D because we got a decrease down here and an increase down here. What about expected population deviation rate? The reverse is true because remember, if we hold tolerable deviation rate higher, to make the sample size get smaller, we want to increase the distance here. So expected population rate is going to, deviation rate is going to decrease, okay? So again, direct relationship with confidence level. So as it decreases, our sample size decreases. An indirect relation, or sorry, inverse relationship within the distance between these two. So as this goes up, as this increases, as this stays the same, then we would decrease our sample size, or as this decreases, it would stay this, or would decrease our sample size. So an interesting question that talks about the relationship between all those categories. I think this is a good question. If you understand it, great. If you don't understand it, please take a look at it before you sit for the exam in a few weeks. All right. Question number 819. Oh, I love this question. I love this question. All right. Assume that an auditor is evaluating a statistical attribute sample of 50 items that resulted in 3 deviations. What should the auditor conclude if the tolerable deviation rate is 7%, the expected population deviation rate is 5%, and the allowance for sampling risk is 2%? Whole lot of numbers on that, but we got to know what numbers we're specifically looking for. Okay. So what are we comparing to? We're comparing tolerable deviation rate. So 7% to what? We talked about some of the computed upper deviation rate. Does everybody remember that? Computed upper deviation rate And that was a number that we got from our tables. But I talked about the theory behind that particular number. Computed upward deviation rate, it's a combination of two figures, okay? The first one is our sample deviation rate, all right? What's our sample deviation rate in this problem? So, yeah, 3 divided by 50, so 6%. So say 3 divided by 50 is 6%. So there's 6% deviations in our sample, all right? So everybody with me so far? All right. Basically, we use that as our sample to actually judge the basis. Now, the true population deviation rate is somewhere around 6%. We don't know what it is, but we can say it be as low as a certain number, as high as a certain number. We don't care about the low end. All we care about is what the top end is. So we're going to add something to that, which is the allowance for sampling risk. Okay. So the allowance for sampling risk is 2%. 6% plus 2% is 8%. If we compare that to tolerable deviation rate of 7%, does that mean the control is effective or not? It is not effective. The control is not effective. All right. So which one of those best describes what we just talked about? Let's look at D. The planned level of assessed control risk should be modified because the sample deviation rate plus the allowance for sampling risk exceeds the tolerable deviation rate. Does that sound like what we just talked about here? Yes. Okay. It's pretty complex. It requires a pretty innate understanding of what we talked about on Wednesday, but I do think it's a worthwhile endeavor to understand the context in here. If you understand all this stuff clearly, you should feel pretty good about where you stand in Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is going to have minimal focus, but there's a few things I want to talk about. Which of the following sample methods we use to estimate a numeric measurement of population such as dollar value? Well, first of all, we only talked about two methods of sampling, okay? We talked about attribute sampling and variable sampling. Attribute sampling answers a yes/no question. Does a particular attribute exist? It is used almost exclusively for test of controls. By the way, this is important to note. I actually asked my graduate students this earlier today because we were doing some CPA prep, and I said, when do we use attribute sampling? And I got a lot of blank stares. Okay, I don't normally call it my seminar students, but come on, attribute sampling, guys. You remember this? 417. So for those of you who are going to be in the graduate program and sit in seminar at some point in the future, I'm going to say the same thing. You guys remember this? Attribute sampling 417, and then you're going to recall this, and you're going to say, oh yeah, that's what Dr. Barnes was saying. Attribute sampling is used exclusively as a test of controls, or almost exclusively as a test of controls. Why? Because we're looking for a particular attribute. In this case, is the control effective or not? Yes or no. Okay. The other one is variable sampling. Variable sampling we talked a little bit about. Variable sampling is trying to actually determine what is the misstatement in the population based on the misstatement we observe in the sample. So if I take 10% of the population as my sample, then presumably any misstatements I find in my sample are going to be projected roughly tenfold. It's not precisely tenfold, but it's going to be roughly that. It's going to be roughly that. So we use the sample to try to estimate what the population misstatement is. So variable sampling is the other one we talked about. That's where we estimate a numeric measure of population, such as dollar values of variable sampling. Okay. 916. How would an increase in tolerable misstatement in the assessed level control risk affect the sample size in substantive test of details? You guys noticing a trend here? I'd like to ask a lot about the direction of sample size in these situations. Probably a really important thing to remember, not just for the exams, but also for just auditing in general. So if I increase tolerable misstatement, what happens to my sample size? Let's think about the nature of tolerable misstatement back from materiality. Tolerable misstatement basically dictates how much work I have to do. If that number is larger, how much work do I have to do? Is it less or more? Less, okay? So does that equate to a larger sample size or a smaller sample size? Smaller sample size, because we have to look at fewer items, okay? So if I increase my tolerable misstatement, I decrease my sample size. So it's going to be either A or B. The increased assessed level of control risk, okay? Increased assessed level of control risk. So in this particular situation, I increased my assessed level of control risk. I'm concerned that the control risk is going to be a bigger issue than I first thought. So does that mean if control risk is increasing, is that a bad thing or a good thing for the auditor? It's a bad thing because that means that we're going to have to do more work later on. Okay. So we're going to increase our sample size. All right. So decrease sample size for tolerable misstatement, increase assessed level of control risk would increase our sample size in this scenario. All right. So problems now. Just as a reminder for these problems, these are from Chapter 7 problems. The ones that we're looking at, they only give you two opportunities or two options. They give you significant deficiency or material weakness, which is nice and convenient, but that's not sufficient for the exam. Look at the practice exam. There will be questions that are going to talk about whether they're going to be no deficiency, control deficiency, significant deficiency, or material weakness. You need to consider all those scenarios. And remember, that's based on the both dimensions of likelihood and magnitude. In this situation, because it's either significant deficiency or material weakness, we assume likelihood has been established. We're looking probably almost exclusively at magnitude. All right. The entity uses a standard sales contract for most of my transactions. Individual transactions are not material to the entity. Sales personnel are allowed to modify sales contract terms. The entity's accounting function reviews significant and unusual modifications in sales contract terms, but does not review the changes in the standard shipping terms. Changes in standard shipping terms could require delay in timing of revenue recognition. Management reviews gross margin on a monthly basis and investigates any significant or unusual relationships. In addition, management reviews the reasonableness of inventory levels at the end of each accounting period. The entity has experienced limited situations in which revenue has been appropriately recorded in advance of shipment, but amounts have not been material. All right, so this is about as cut and dry as they get. Which one is this? Significant deficiency or material weakness? Yeah, significant deficiency. Those constant statements about being not material are kind of the clue here. Now, let's talk about this in aggregate. We have a lot of transactions. Is it possible that even though individual transactions may not be material, that together in aggregate they might be? Is that a possibility? It's probably a possibility. If I'm talking about it, you're just like, yeah, Dr. Barnes, that sounds reasonable to me. Yeah. So yeah, that's going to be a possibility. What information in this problem says that this is probably not a major issue? Does it appear that management does some review of this particular problem and they have that on their mind, that if there's any major or significant issues or significant problems, that they address those? Yeah, they talk about that. The management reviews gross margin monthly basis and indicates any significant or unusual relationships. So there is some redundancy in the control here, even though there is still a pretty significant control deficiency. So this is a significant deficiency. Entity has a standard sales contract, but sales personnel frequently modify the terms of the contract. Darn those sales personnel. The nature of the modifications can affect the timing and amount of revenue recognized. Individual sales transactions are frequently material to the entity, and the gross margin can vary significantly for each transaction. The entity does not have procedures in place for the accounting function to regularly review modifications of sales contract terms. Although management reviews gross margin on a monthly basis, the same differences in gross margin on individual transactions make it difficult for management to identify potential misstatements. Improper revenue recognition has occurred, and the amounts have been material. All right, so just as A was pretty cut and dry, this one is too. Which one is this? Material weakness. This is definitely a material weakness right here. Definitely a material weakness. And we can actually look that there's a lot of redundant information that talks about why it is. They use the words material and say that the transactions are material. Individual transactions are material. Even in aggregate, if they were material, looks like management tries to do their job, but fails. They aren't able to identify any potential misstatements. So this is pretty easy, about as easy as it gets. Entity is a standard sales contract, but sales personnel frequently modify the terms of the contracts. I'm about on board to fire the sales personnel. What do you guys think? We're going to riot, say, fire the sales personnel. We're taking over, okay? Because apparently sales personnel are not trustworthy. Sales personnel frequently grant unauthorized and underrecorded sales discounts to customers without the knowledge of the accounting department, as they shouldn't. The amounts are deducted by customers and paying the invoices are recorded as outstanding balances on their accounts receivable aging. Although these amounts are individually insignificant, when added up, they are material and have occurred regularly over the past few years. Now, this one is less clear because individual transactions are not material, but in aggregate, they are material. What do you guys think? This one's the first one that requires judgment on our part. First two were pretty straightforward. This one's going to require judgment. Significant deficiency or material weakness. There are no wrong answers here except for the one that's incorrect. Which one do you think? I'm going to say material weakness. Yeah, material weakness. It's material weakness. So that doesn't give us a lot of information about management review in this particular area, but it seems like there's not a lot of redundancy simply because the aggregation of these transactions has been frequently material and has occurred pretty consistently. If it didn't occur consistently, I might be, well, this is a one-time event, but it goes back that it's occurred consistency kind of gives us me pause about saying, yeah, I don't particularly trust this process area. So the salespeople, they got to be put in check. Those salespeople need to be put in check. Material weakness for C. All right. Following are examples of control deficiencies that may represent significant deficiencies or material weaknesses. For each of the following scenarios, indicate whether the deficiency or significant deficiency or material weakness. Justify your decision. During its assessment of ICOFR, the management of Lawrence Corporation, its auditors identified the following control deficiencies that individually represent significant deficiencies. This is interesting. So we've got three types of control deficiencies that are significant deficiencies. How do we aggregate those together? How do we consider those together? So Says inadequate segregation duties over informal system access controls. Now, you know how I feel when I see no segregation duties. I'm gonna basically say that's automatically a material weakness. It's not, but I just have really passionate about good segregation of duties. All right. Several instances of transactions that were not properly recorded in subsidiary ledgers, while the transactions were recorded properly, were not material. The gross amount of the transactions of the type total up to amount several times materiality, and the lack of timely reconciliation of the account balances affected by improperly recorded transactions. Okay. So here's the problem. We have what we call significant deficiencies for individual transactions. If we look, it says that the individual transactions are not material, but the aggregation are material. Now, you as the auditor, if you walk into this scenario, are you going to be confident that management or other areas of the organization are going to have remediating controls in this area? Probably not, because there's no segregation of duties, okay? And there's no timely reconciliations in this area. So even though they say individually, these are all significant deficiencies, in aggregate, what would you say this process area represents? I'm leading you down the primrose path. All you've got to do is you've got to say the words, okay? You've got to say the words. I'm going to give you a hint. It starts with material. Material weakness. That's right, everybody. A material weakness, okay? It's a material weakness. Now, again, it's not common for something like this to happen, but when you have an aggregation of related transactions or related deficiencies in one area, that area is going to be problematic, and it's likely to result in material misstatement. In fact, has, because it says the gross amount of transactions that type total up to amount several times materiality. All right, this one's one of my favorite ones. During its assessment of ICOFR, management of First Coast Bank Corp and its auditors identified the following deficiencies that individually represent significant deficiencies: design of controls of estimation of credit losses, a critical accounting estimate, the operating effectiveness controls for initiating, processing, or reviewing adjustments for the allowance for collective loss, so in a related area, and the operating effectiveness controls designed to prevent and detect improper recognition of interest income. In addition, during the past year, First Coast experienced a significant level of growth in the loan balances that were subjected to controls governing credit loss estimation and revenue recognition, and further growth is expected in the coming year, okay? So let's analyze this. This is an interesting question. This says that we have a series of related significant deficiencies from prior years. The big difference is, and then this year, that there's a lot of growth in the area which these controls regulate. So in the past, they were just significant deficiencies. Can we make an argument that these significant deficiencies in this current period have been upgraded to material weakness? Is anybody willing to make that argument? If no one else will, I will. I'll step up, mostly because I'm the instructor and I don't know what the correct answer is because I've got the solutions manual, okay? But yes, I think that's a reasonable approach to make, because remember, our definition of significant deficiency, not a problem now, could become a problem in the future. How could something become a problem in the future if it's not a problem now? Well, if there's a lot of growth in the area that the controls are supposed to govern, those controls become much more relevant. So these significant deficiencies could easily escalate to material weakness, and I think there's a very easy argument to make that this is going to be material weakness. All right. Last few problems. You guys remember this? So 825 and 826, you're going to have to do some testing of control procedures here based on some results. So the very first thing we had to do is we had to estimate sample size. And hopefully you remembered that there were some tables in the book that I actually put on Brightspace that you refer back to. So let's just go ahead and let's get what these numbers are. So starting with sample size, got risk of incorrect acceptance, which risk of incorrect acceptance of 5% implies what for confidence level? 95%. All right. So if we have a 95% confidence level, tolerable deviation rate of 4%, and expected population deviation rate of 1%, what's our sample size? 117. I got a different one. 156. 156. All right. Now, here's an interesting question. So we've got the same confidence level here. I don't know why that moved. Okay. The same confidence level here, tolerable deviation rate of 5% and an expected population rate of deviation rate of 2%. Now you'll notice the distance between those two items is roughly the same. So should we expect a sample size that's roughly the same amount? There's going to be a little bit of deviation here, but for the most part, I'd say it's going to be a pretty large number, just like the previous one was. So what's your sample size in this scenario? What'd you guys come up with? 181? All right, moving on. Confidence level of 90%, 7 and 3. What's our sample size here? 94. And same question as before, if you look, we got a confidence level of 90%, tolerable deviation at 8 and 4, same distance between these two, so 4% distance. So we're going to assume our sample size is probably around 94. Is it? Is that what your results came up with? So I wrote down X for every single one of these, Dr. Barnes. They were exactly identical because X is a variable. It can be anything. If you did, that's innovative thinking right there. That's really innovative thinking. That's not what I was going for, but that's innovative thinking. Actually, yes, it's 98, okay? X equals 98 in this scenario. All right, so let's go ahead and drop our sample size down here. All right, 826. So give us the table that we need to fill out, sample deviation rate, pretty easy. All we have to do is take this number here divided by this number here. So number 1 is pretty straightforward. 0 divided by anything is 0. 5 divided by 181 is going to be 2.8%. 4 divided by 94 is 4.3%. 3 divided by 98 is 3.1%. All right. So that was not necessary for the table because you're actually going to calculate computed upper deviation rate. Because keep in mind, this is what our sample looks like. Is our sample perfectly representative of the population? No, it would be nice if it is. Because then before we just did sampling, we could say we know exactly what the deviation rate is in the population. But we have to kind of infer what the population limits are based on the sample. So if this is 0, it's possible, remotely possible, that our population is also 0% deviation rate. In all likelihood, it's something above 0%, very close to 0%. It looks like they're very good, but still above 0%. So we're going to tack on some allowance for sampling risk onto here. So if we got a computed upper deviation rate of 0%, or sorry, sample deviation of 0%, our computed upper deviation rate is 2, okay? It's 2%. And just like before, for some reason, I didn't put percentages in here, which is just really frustrating. You'd think I'd know better by now. All right, so 4% is our tolerable deviation rate. Our computed upper deviation rate is 2%. If you're the auditor here, are you happy or sad? Dancing, just like, yeah, I'm not going to dance. All right, so we're pretty happy about it. Pretty happy because the control is effective. All right. All right. And then we're going to go down here. So 181. Again, these are on the tables that we're looking at in Brightspace or on in your book. The tables are kind of non-intuitive because you may come up with different numbers here, but we'll just operate with there. We're going to also hopefully run through this in idea real quick. All right. So computed upper deviation rate in this particular scenario where it's 2.8%, it's something above 2.8%. It's going to be 6.9. Okay. 6.9% versus 5%. What do we feel about that? Yeah, control is not effective. Control is not effective. That makes us sad. All right. 4 out of 94, 4.3%. Computed upper deviation rate is going to be 8.7%. 8.7 versus 7%. Same scenario. Not happy. Seems like the more errors we have, the more work we have to do as an auditor. Isn't that weird how that works? Yeah. All right. 3.1%. Computed upper deviation rate is going to be 7.3. 7.3 versus 8%. Tolerable deviation rate wins. We can accept this control as being effective. All right. So this is what you did if you worked by the tables. Now, just for context, I want to do it one more time because we've got a few minutes and I want to make sure that my lesson that we had from Syncs Home, because we talked about if we use idea as a tool. Oh, and I got disconnected. All right, you got lucky because I'm not going to reconnect. I wanted to show you idea, but I was only going to do it if I didn't have to reconnect because that's going to take several minutes to get done. All right, so we're just going to pretend that I worked an idea and you all learned a whole lot from that particular experience, but somehow you also still got 16 minutes out of class early. Have a good weekend. I'll see you all on Monday.